She loved me in every life. Except this one. The thought arrived the way most dangerous things did in Briana Rivera's life. Quietly, between two beeps, while a machine counted breath, and the corridor outside smelled of lemon oil and bleach, and the faint metallic sweetness of late-night coffee. It lodged without permission, a small, impossible tenderness that had no business fitting into the margin of her shifts, into the shape her life had taken since Leo. It was a private, ridiculous sentence she had heard once in a dream years ago, or read in a half-drunk note from some friend who liked to dramatize fate. And tonight it threaded the fluorescent air like a hairline fracture. The ER at 2 a.m. was a blunt instrument, doors closed with practiced impatience. A nurse folded a gown at the foot of a bed and set it down like a finished argument. Briana moved through it with the quiet economy of someone who measured out hope in procedures. Check pulses, change dressings, press gentleness into the pauses between questions. Her hands remembered the weight of bodies, the rhythm of triage. Her head remembered the math of custody schedules and rent deadlines. Her heart lived mostly in a plastic school backpack by the locker, Leo's scuffed dinosaur sticker visible at the zipper, a little domestic artifact that could undo any larger narrative in the world if anyone misplaced it. She was on the stall that had the worst fluorescent light, by the window that never opened, and the patient was a man who had been dumb enough to fall asleep on a ladder. His cheek was a map of red. She taped him back together with the same low-resolution kindness she gave everyone. Assessment, analgesic, a stern but practical lecture about ladders and pride. He left with his wife holding him like a harbor. Briana cataloged the scene in the way nurses did, vital signs and whether the family needed social work, then scrubbed her hands of blood and worry and pulled on a fresh pair of gloves. The night had the patience to become ordinary again, to trick the body into thinking this was normal. But she could feel the hinge in her shoulders, the single thought that was allowed to take up space because there was no room for anything else. She had rehearsed the lines she would say if someone, some proper, messy, human someone, broke in on her life. She had rehearsed them with the same clinical clarity she used to deliver bad news. Nobody crossed the threshold to Leo without her consent. Nobody inked promises on the inside of his life without endangering the whole. The door to the ER's staff corridor banged inward like a weather front. She'd been expecting relatives at 3, a routine pickup. She had not been expecting perfume, or the sound a pair of Italian heels made on tile when they decided to announce themselves like a court summons. Valentina Moretti made the hospital smell like a different city. She did not look lost. She looked finished. Her coat was the precise, insolent black of someone who kept people's plans in her sleeve. There was mud on one heel, and a single smudge of red near her temple, not from blood so much as from a life that liked to flirt dangerously close to that color. People glanced. There was recognition in the way her name drew the nurse's interest. Not because Valentina pursued attention, but because she carried a reputation hard enough to shade the air. Briana felt that instead of watched, like a pressure in her ears. Valentina's eyes were a cool and deliberate thing. She walked with someone's power in her stride, measured, contained, the kind that had been earned in a room where men had been loud and wrong, and she had been quieter and correct. When she paused a little too close to the nurse's station, the world made room for her. Everyone who had ever known how to negotiate, how to shift a room without moving, recognized that economy. "You're Briana Rivera," she said, as if they were making a small but consequential substitution in a ledger. It was a statement, not a question. Briana felt the name land like a medical diagnosis in the space between them. No theatrics, only information. "Yes," Briana answered. Her voice could be dry steel when she meant it. She had seen Valentina's type before, people who used presence as currency, who could pay for favors with a calm, stacking hush. It was a form of violence in itself, the ease with which some could slide the world into place. Briana's hands owned that knowingness. They had learned how to say no without being cruel. Valentina unfolded a single rose from under her coat and set it on the counter like a signed contract. The rose was dark at its tips, contradicted by a black ribbon knotted around its stem. There was a card, too. A small, precise square of cream upon which the single letter V had been written in a hand that was both familiar and unreadable. "For Leo?" asked a nurse, unable to make the inventory of this small trespass. "For Briana," Valentina corrected. She kept her gaze on Briana. When she spoke, there was no pretense of apology. "For the nurse who keeps a bargain with a child." Briana did not take the rose. She did not want to be the romantic cliché standing at the scene of her own life. She took the card with the same economy she administered medications, clean, efficient, keeping any procedure from becoming sentimental. The handwriting had a slanted, insistent quality, like someone who wrote letters to themselves to remember the truth. "You can't come in here when you want," Briana said finally. The words had a professional ring, boundary setting disguised as a bedside manner. "This is a public hospital. People are hurt." Valentina smiled, a small, quiet tilt. "I don't want to be a problem." She meant it. Briana watched her measuring it out. "Then don't be," Briana said. "For Leo's sake. No unannounced visits, no interference in his life. You respect that?" She said the list in phrases like a nurse checking vitals. 1, 2, 3. The list was non-negotiable. Valentina's hand, for the first time, was slow. "I will," she said. It had the possibility of truth in it. Briana filed the moment under measured precaution and left it there. Outside in the staff corridor, the fluorescent was less forgiving. The rose looked ridiculous in the harsh light, but the black ribbon made it into something that had once been a threat now rendered into an offering. She tucked the card into her wallet more carefully than she knew she would bury it. The night took its ordinary turns again. Patients came and left. A resident argued about ventilators with a family who wanted any kind of miracle she could not give. Briana checked her phone twice and found 3 messages from her sister, 3 from her landlord, and, pinned between a work message about a class she might take and a picture of Leo asleep with a plastic dinosaur, the tiniest dent of curiosity. V. She closed her bag at dawn and walked through the hospital into the fogged early morning that housed everything that demanded time and attention. She was exhausted in that bone-level way that makes the next 12 hours feel like an experiment in endurance. Her shifts were mathematical. Hours worked, formula for rent, formula for saving, and the stubborn protective variable named Leo. He was 7, a small human who knew the rituals of bedtimes and chicken soup, and how to hurt a mother without meaning to. His world was small and sacred. Briana's rules were drawn around it. If you love slow-burn romances, like and subscribe. She paused at the diner out of habit more than hunger. The neon sign hummed like a promise that would not keep itself. It was the kind of booth that held secrets, vinyl sticky with the oil of 1,000 late meals, the kind of light that softened confessions. Valentina was already there, in the corner, as if the city had adjustable chairs and the seat had been reserved. When Briana sat, the air between them calmed into conversational temperature. "You came," Briana said. "You took my rose," Valentina replied. She said it not with possessiveness, but with a fact. You might as well have accepted an invitation. Briana drank coffee the way some people chewed their nails. She asked the questions that kept her own edges intact. "What do you want?" she asked. It was the practical, human question. It had the blunt, efficient cadence of orders at triage. Valentina stared at the booth's formica, and then at Briana, as if cataloging her like a case file. "I want to be present." That was a sentence that could mean anything. It could mean a threat or a hope. Briana pinned it down with the same precision she used to bind wounds. "Define present," she said. Valentina smiled without letting her posture change. "To come when invited," she said. "To sit in places that are lit and not shadowed. To bring receipts instead of favors. To sign things in ink." Briana bit back a snort that had nothing to do with humor and everything to do with unbelief. "You mean, you're going civic? Volunteer hours?" PTA sign-ups? Legal channels? Yes, Valentina said. The way she agreed was like someone learning to say the names of unfamiliar instruments, if that is what it takes. And no surprises, Briana added. No show-ups at the school without me knowing. Leo's safety is a clause in any new life you try to build with me. Valentina reached out, and for the first time in a long time, touched Briana's hand. It was a physical punctuation that didn't ask permission. The contact was small, domestic. The kind of touch that left an imprint on the bones, because it was so ordinary. I would like permission, she said softly. I don't want your obedience. Those words dug into Briana more than an accusation ever could. Permission. The distinction was everything. Briana had seen people demand obedience as if it were a measure of love. She had rarer memories of relationships built on permission. The consenting, small, daily choices that kept someone safe. Briana's life was a ledger of permission. Who could pick up her son, when he could stay late? Whether anyone could sign a consent form in her absence. I need evidence, Briana said, because that was where the conversation had to begin. Not promises, receipts, volunteer logs, invoices, names of who you've handed over your contacts to. If you can show me that you can translate influence into care, then we'll talk about trust. Valentina's laugh was private. You sound like a board meeting. You sound like someone with options, Briana said. It was both the truth and a rebuke. She wanted to be fair. She wanted to love where love could be asked for and given, but she would not be the risk on which someone else's reputation pivoted. The diner staff cleared a dish with a practiced hand and left them to their negotiation. Valentina leaned forward and produced, from the inside of her coat, a small thing folded like it was valuable. A photograph, maybe, or a receipt. Briana braced, not for intimidation, but because habit had taught her to expect storms under the smallest things. It was a list of names, a page of volunteer sign-ups Valentina had already inked with her own handwriting. It was not performative. It smelled faintly of coffee. There were dates that began to arc into continuity. Briana's chest constricted, but the tightness was different from what she'd learned to expect from fear. It was a kind of cautious hope. You start small, Valentina said. You do the humdrum. You show up. We document. We make it boring and lawful. Briana let the possibility breathe for a second. It was a strange kind of miracle, that someone accustomed to commanding might be willing to show up in the small, undramatic ways that built ordinary life. She thought of Leo's small hands, of how easily the world could be tilted by a headline or a rumor. She thought of the stack of bills on the table at home. She thought of a rose with a black ribbon, an odd little threat made domesticated by being put down on a counter. You have to keep your friends and your enemies separate from this, she said. If your past becomes my problem, I will cut the tie. I will protect him. Valentina's silence was its own answer. Her throat worked around some memory the way someone will swallow a bitter taste in the back of an airplane. Your terms, she said at last. Her voice was small with the gravity of someone learning rules for a new life. I don't want to be the reason your home is unsafe. They left the diner with less certainty than one would hope, but with more possibility than either expected. Briana drove home with the card, V, in the visor, tucked like a small, private talisman. The streetlights slid by in the shape of neighborhood ritual. Leo's bicycle was propped in the driveway where he had left it at 3 p.m, after a fight about whether he could go to the neighbor's house. He was at his friend's. Briana called because she could, because she liked to know where the little ironies of her life resided. He answered with the short, bright voice of a child who trusted his world to the muscle memory of his mother's rules. She liked roses, you know, Leo said on the phone, with the priority of children who archive details for future use. I found a rock and painted it for her. I put it in the garden. Tell your friend thanks for putting it back, Briana said. She tucked the phone between her shoulder and jaw, while she turned on the kettle and checked the oven. And get to bed. Tomorrow we have school. She thought of the painted rock, a childish offering, and felt a softness open and close in the place where her tenderness lived. She did not want the painted rock to be a currency in some future negotiation. She meant to preserve the sanctity of small things. Back in her apartment, she set her bag down and found the card still in her visor. She traced the V with a fingertip, as if the letter might explain the shape of this intrusion. She placed the rose in a jar with water and set it on the kitchen table, out of reach of little hands. The bloom's petals were dark, as if someone had tried to teach beauty to keep watch. That night, Leo slept like a small animal, sprawled across his bed with a nightlight glowing into the corner. Briana sat at the kitchen table with the card between her fingers. She read and reread the letter like a diagnosis she could not yet treat. V. The letter folded its own secrecy into the room. There was a line of soap suds on the sink where she had been too tired to rinse, and the TV murmured in the other room a half-remembered sitcom laugh. She found herself whispering the phrase from the beginning of the night into the mug of cooling coffee. She loved me in every life, except this one. It felt both like confession and the kind of superstition that people passed like heirlooms. For a moment she imagined someone else's hand writing the sentence on the back of an old postcard. Someone whose handwriting leaned and slid into the same slant as the card with the single V. In the morning, the neighborhood was ordinary. Folding chairs, an elderly man sweeping his stoop, a child practicing his jump rope technique on the sidewalk. People who built their lives in small increments. Briana walked Leo to school herself. It was a ritual she kept because she wanted to see the way his back straightened when he was with her, because it was a measure of normalcy she could not afford to outsource. The school smelled like glue and paint, and the faint tang of canned fruit cups. Parents took turns reading for class. There were sign-up sheets tacked to the bulletin board with names in pens of varying desperation. Valentina's name appeared on one such sheet weeks later, in the cramped scrawl of someone who had learned to do the domestic boring things with careful, uneven handwriting. She had signed up for 2 slots, one at the reading hour and one at the fall bake sale. Briana watched the form from across the street and felt a flurry of protective suspicion. She had been careful. She had told Valentina the terms. She had made the conditions which, in her mind, kept her son safe. Now the proof had to speak. They began small. At first, Valentina came in with a bag of muffins from a bakery Briana had never heard of. She wore a volunteer vest that hung awkwardly over the expensive cut of her coat. It was the way people learned how to be small in public without losing themselves. She arrived 15 minutes early and set up chairs with the efficient economy of someone who had given orders to sets of men and had learned to make a room look like something softer. The first time she brought a box of crayons and kneeled to help a child color within lines, Briana's breath hitched because it was a domestic miracle. A great strategist, learning to be tender. Amanda, Briana's friend from the ER who had a laugh that made everything less solemn, watched from across the room with her characteristic mix of suspicion and giddy curiosity. "She's very good at this," Amanda said once, leaning in the doorway like a sentry. "She has a way. It's almost unnerving." Valentina did not try to be charming. She was listening. She watched as Leo ran across the yard after the bell, his backpack making the shape of small gravity, and she put the muffin tin down with the kind of reverence you reserve for instruments you intend to learn. When Briana caught her hand again, it was without expectation, simply a human touch in a hallway where hands passed like ballots. The courting was not a thing of sonnets. It moved as courtships that endured did, by small acts, a coffee left on a clipboard at the ER, anonymously, when Briana was stuck with double shifts. A burger at midnight when the cafeteria had closed and Valentina had noticed some internal post-it about Briana's habit of surviving on hospital vending machines. There were gifts for Leo that were not the kind to make a child's life richer, but the kind to make the home exist with less friction. A winter coat, a replacement for the plastic dinosaur that Leo had broken in a fit of unsupervised play, a used bear left in the pediatric play area with a note pinned to its ear saying, "For Leo. From V." Briana measured each one. She tallied them like a nurse counts doses. She looked at the receipts Valentina produced one week. A volunteer roster signed, an invoice for a neighborhood cleanup, an address where she had pledged to teach a finance class in the community center. The receipts were the pale, bureaucratic proof Briana had asked for. They were not absolution. They were instead an economy of small, prolonged labor that might, if it continued, become trust. At night, Briana found she was thinking less about the black ribbon and more about the steady accumulation of ordinary papers. Receipts, logs, volunteer vests folded in odd places. Her mind kept running the diagnosis. Was this healing or performance? And the only treatment for doubt was time. Time and continued boring paperwork. Valentina, in her spare moments, had small gestures that ate at the edges of Briana's defenses. She did not confess sins with grandeur. She acknowledged them in the way she arranged mail, the way she signed small forms, the way she set boundaries with people who wanted a favor in exchange for old loyalties. She asked permission to come to dinner sometimes. And Briana, who had learned to conserve the sacred spaces for her son, found herself saying yes on evenings when she wanted the house to be full of the kind of noise that meant safety. They spoke sometimes of the impossible phrase that had lodged in Briana's head. It would arrive as a half-joke, or a thing Valentina would say with a flat smile, and they would both watch it settle on the table like a test. "I had a woman tell me once that you find people in different lives," Valentina said one evening, half abstract as she folded napkins beside the sink. "My grandmother, maybe. She'd say that sometimes you get it right, sometimes you don't." Briana wanted to be skeptical. She wanted superstition to be someone else's currency. Yet when Valentina's fingers brushed hers over the dish towel, she felt the sentence shift from a rhetorical flourish to the underside of possibility. There were private small recognitions. A way Valentina signed her name that matched a particular curl Briana remembered from a childhood postcard. A hummed lullaby that, when heard at 3 a.m, made Briana's heart betray itself. They began to stitch the phrase into conversation as if testing its edges. "She loved me in every life," Valentina would say, with a half-challenged voice, looking up to see if Briana would meet the claim. "Except this one." The words were an admission and a dare. Briana found herself repeating the last line in her mind at odd moments, like a diagnostic code. Except this one. There were boundaries that mattered. No secrets about money that could hide a favor gone wrong. Transparency about who Valentina still answered to. Full disclosure about any contact that might endanger Leo. If Valentina did not deliver such details, the rules were clear. Briana would withdraw. Trust was not a switch for the past to be sanctified by present gesture. Trust had to be built with receipts, with refusals, when old acquaintances demanded old loyalties. "You have to tell me everything about your life that could touch his," Briana told her one night, in the kitchen lit by a single lamp. Leo had long been in bed, but the shape of the boy was a sleeping presence in the other room, like an argument for prudence. "Who calls you? Who do you know? If your name shows up in a headline or a phone rings with a number you don't want to give me, I want the truth. No delays. No omissions." Valentina put down the dish she was drying and stood very still. "I will be transparent," she said. The phrase was almost a prayer for someone who had been raised to move in shadows. "But understand this. My life is not clean. There are things that will stain the edges of whatever I try to build. I cannot erase them. I can only choose in each moment how to use them." That was a genuine admission. Briana heard it like a diagnosis she would have to treat not with denial, but with practical measures. "Then we set the method," Briana said. "There's a list you'll sign. There are channels you pass favors into. No informal debt collection by anyone who still thinks they own the past. You behave as if your priorities have shifted, and we'll see if your actions follow." It was a marriage of purpose, not romance. And yet there were afternoons when they would sit on Briana's couch, and the light would be right, and a soft domesticity would settle into the room like a new rug. They would watch Leo play at the foot of the couch, and Valentina would, without being asked, rearrange the throw pillows so that the space felt safe in its order. Those small acts accumulated into an odd architecture of trust. But the city always had other plans. The kind of life Valentina had once inhabited did not dissolve because someone decided to be lawful. There were threads that reached back and made the present taut. Phone calls came at odd hours from people who remembered bargains in the old language of favors. Valentina would answer, and then sit with a clouded face and come back to Briana like someone who had been collared by memory and then released. She would tell Briana, plainly and without drama, that she had refused a demand, that she had signed those pages and assigned that contact to Marco, that she had asked Isabella to oversee the handover. Briana took the names as she took dosages, with the clarity of someone who needed to know exact instructions. They were still governments unto themselves, a mother and a woman trying to make a life in measured steps. Briana's work at the hospital remained a stern gravity. There were nights when she was called away, and nights when a patient's child would remind her of Leo, and her chest would ache with that old, complicated devotion. She learned to compartmentalize, a skill necessary to both motherhood and medicine. Valentina learned, too, what it meant to show up for the dull things: volunteer rosters, PTA meetings, invoices, not because they were glamorous, but because they were concrete. On a Friday night, the city smelled like rain on warm asphalt, and Briana found on her kitchen table a small package, a painted rock with a faded dinosaur scrawl, and beneath it, a narrow envelope. Her name was on it, in the same strong handwriting as V. She slid it open, and out fell a single folded sheet. There was a line in a language Briana did not expect to hear in a hospital kitchen, a line so small it felt like a private defiance. "She loved you in every life," the page read in careful loops. "Except this one." Briana looked at the sentence and felt, for the first time since the rose, the old diagnostic certainty shift. It was provocative, it was tender, and it was terrifying in the way all things potent and undemonstrative are. She had not yet decided whether it was cruelty or mercy. She left the paper on the table and went to check on Leo. He was asleep, mouth open in the way toddlers and 7-year-olds trusted their nights to the world. His breath was steady and uncomplicated. Briana tucked the blanket and smoothed the duvet, and when she came back to the kitchen, the line on the paper was still there. Less like a threat, and more like a question pitched to the ceiling. Could a life be different if the people in it kept learning how to be ordinary? At the hospital the following week, a transfer came in. A woman with a nose broken in multiple places and the rest of her face untouched, as if something sharp had chosen only the soft parts. Valentina did not come to the ER that night. She was elsewhere, in the kind of room Briana suspected might be used for negotiations. In the stairwell, 2 nurses speculated softly. "She's been in worse," one said. "She's been around men who like to make problems small." Briana moved through the shift with the methodical calm of someone who knew how to treat fractures and keep the children tucked away from adult reckonings. The city outside threatened to stitch itself into the edges of their quiet. A headline here, a rumor there. Valentina's name moved in the paper with the nonchalance of a stone thrown into water. Every ripple met the terms Briana had already set. She kept the list of terms in her phone. She kept receipts in a folder marked with a post-it that said, "Trust." She believed in evidence the way she believed in medicine. In the small hours between emergencies, Briana would sometimes repeat the line to herself in a whisper. "She loved me in every life, except this one." It was a litany she did not know whether she wanted to dismiss. It felt like a dare. It felt like history uncomfortable in a new dress. At the center of everything was a child's sleep. That remained the truth she could not negotiate away. The errands of grown people, the negotiations and receipts and polite domesticities, had to orbit that reality. If anything threatened Leo, Briana had a small, private arsenal, articulated with the clarity of someone who had been tested by hardship. Rules, documentation, guardianship forms, a lawyer's contact she had not needed yet but kept on speed dial. She would sign whatever papers were necessary to keep him safe. She would cut away any ties that presented themselves as threats. The rose in the jar on the table began to darken at the edges. Petals fell like small, precise confessions. The black ribbon curled at the stem. The card with the letter V had been shoved into the back of a drawer and then not touched for days. Briana did not know whether she was being cautious or cruel. She only knew she needed to see the receipts, to prove to herself that this new person could make a life where Leo was only a child and not a lever. Valentina, for her part, moved through the mundane with the clumsy grace of someone learning an unfamiliar language. She volunteered at the library and came to the bake sale in an apron she did not own. She made friends with people who had been in the neighborhood for longer than she had ever planned to live. She took the bus when she could, complained about it in that private way that made people feel human and thereby less dangerous. She began, in the small hours, to leave notes for Briana. Receipts organized, names listed, the time she had spent at the shelter written down. Each piece of paper was a small and steady litany. Here is proof. One evening, when the city was a net of yellow windows and the world outside breathed in cooler air, Valentina waited on Briana's stoop. She did not knock with a fanfare. She did not come like a storm. She had a small, pragmatic look on her face, an expression learned from someone who had been called upon to explain things to elders. In her hand, she held a small envelope. Briana opened the door with Leo's small shadow at her feet. He had been pulled from his homework by the smell of cooking, and looked at Valentina as if assessing a wound. She was tired. She was, despite herself, curious. Valentina extended the envelope. "For you," she said. Briana hesitated. It was the kind of moment teachers warned about. One step in, and everything changes. One refusal, and a relationship becomes a closed case. She took the envelope because the child was watching, and it seemed a thing done in civility rather than drama. The envelope was heavy with economy. Briana slid it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a line written in the same careful hand that had signed the earlier notes. The sentence was small, almost embarrassed in its tenderness. "We have loved before. This is not proof of anything. It is an offering. I will earn your life by labor." Briana read it twice. She felt at once exposed and resolute. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket as if it were a surgical tool she might need later. She knew how to refuse enchantments, and she knew how to accept labor. She had rarely been a woman who listened to confessions without asking for evidence. "Do not come by unannounced again," she said, the rule snapping back into place like an overused hinge. "And leave the receipts on the table." Valentina looked at her, really looked, and nodded. "I will," she said. "I want permission, Briana, not your obedience." Permission. Briana reflected on the word as if it were a chart she could read medical signs from. Permission meant ongoing consent, the kind of slow work that asked for rights and gave back safety. Briana wanted safety. She wanted mundane labor. She wanted proof. They stood on the stoop for a moment like two people testing the weather. The child inside hummed to a cartoon, and the city outside had the cleanness of late night. For a second, she wondered whether the line about past lives was a way to sweeten a negotiation, or whether it was, in fact, a true recoil in both their histories, an old recognition like a scar matching a scar. The thought made her chest ache in a way that was not unlike grief. She closed the door with the paper in her pocket and the black ribbon in the jar, and went to tuck Leo in, and the world marched on with the economy of small acts. She loved me in every life, except this one. The sentence was still whispering when the phone on the kitchen counter buzzed with an unknown number. Briana let it ring out, because some numbers were worth waiting for, and some were not. She turned the phone face down and breathed, measuring her next step like a clinician diagnosing a patient who had returned to the ward with an old, complicated wound. The rose's petals had fallen into the jar, and the water had turned faintly pink. Outside the apartment, the city moved untroubled by the private arithmetic of two people trying to translate power into tenderness. Inside, the arithmetic continued, permissions signed, receipts filed, the careful negotiation between desire and duty. The paper was in her pocket, like a tiny suturing of a wound she had not decided whether to hold open. She slept poorly that night, and woke with the weight of the paper against her thigh, a private contraband. The next shift at the ER asked for all the parts of her that were practical. Medication charts, a calm voice for frightened relatives, steady hands when someone's life teetered on the small margin between breath and nothing. Briana moved through it like someone who had learned to perform miracles as a series of small, repeatable motions. When she finally answered the phone, the voice on the other end was a woman's and urgent. "It's Valentina," Amanda said, not explaining but offering the shape of events through the cadence of her worry. "She's at the door. She looks... Bree, you should come." Brianna's first thought was the ledger in her pocket. Her second was a clinic of measures: who was hurt, how badly, and whether Leo would ever know. She left the ER abiding by the triage rule she practiced on everyone else: go to the immediate emergency first, and the moral ones after. She told a colleague to cover her, and stepped into the cold night with only the card V, had given her in the visor, folded into the back of a pocket like a small private talisman. Valentina was on the stoop in earnest this time. She had a smear of dried blood on her temple, and the skin beneath her left eye was purpled. Her silk scarf was knotted clumsily, as if she had had no one to remind her of proprieties. Rain had slicked the hem of her coat into a darker, almost black line. The stool of her stance suggested she had not come for drama, but for sanctuary. Briana opened the door and saw the creature of rumor shrink to the size of a woman in need. There was a hush in the hallway. Neighbors' lights were dimmed. A dog somewhere began to whine and then stopped, as if afraid of making an error. Valentina's voice, when she said Briana's name, was raw in a way Briana had not heard before. "I need to be inside for a minute," she said. Briana barely examined the face. She had a nurse's eye and a mother's caution, both trained like instruments. "You can come in," she said. It was not an offer of mercy so much as a controlled permission. "You have to tell me everything that happened before you step over my threshold." Valentina's hands trembled when she shrugged off her coat. "There was someone at a meeting," she said simply, as if the world would know what that meant and immediately fill in the blanks. "They raised their voice. It got ugly. I left. They followed. She stopped, and then, as if testing the finality of her sentence, ran a hand over the bruise blooming at her eye. "I am fine." Leo, who had put himself to bed earlier without a story, because Briana had been late and distracted, pressed his face against the apartment door at the sound of adult voices. He had the right to be curious, and Briana had the right to protect the exact shape of what he saw. "He's in bed," she called over her shoulder. "You must not go near him until noon tomorrow when we decide it's safe." Valentina nodded like a confessor hearing a rule. She walked through the apartment like someone cataloging the new topography: the school backpack, the bookcase where Leo's drawings were stuck in plastic sleeves, the kitchen table with the jar that still held the dying rose with the black ribbon. She inhaled, and the corners of her mouth quivered with some small private grief. Can I stay until morning?" she asked. Briana's professional instincts and maternal rules clicked into place. She brought a first aid kit and did what she knew best. Applied cold compresses, cleaned away the blood, murmured the clinical things you say to steady a patient who is also a friend. She made tea and busied herself with the small rituals that turned an apartment into a refuge. She put a towel under the bruise. She warmed a bowl of soup for Valentina to eat. She checked the locks with the attention of a woman who had built her life on procedures. They sat at the kitchen table, two women with very different histories touching in that narrow domestic light. Valentina's shoulders folded as if someone had removed the armor she always wore to public rooms. She took the tea with both hands, grateful and embarrassed at once. I didn't want Leo to know, she said quietly. I didn't want to bring noise into the house. You kept hurting yourself instead, Briana said, not unkindly. Why? Valentina's laugh was an involuntary thing, half deflection, half confession. Because I thought I could handle it. Because I thought my past could stay in its lane. Because I was tired. There was a pause where both women weighed consequences. Then Valentina did something Briana had not expected. She reached across the table and placed both of her hands flat on Briana's. The touch was small and unequivocal, asking without demanding, permission without coercion. I don't want your obedience, she said. I want your permission. I will accept the boundaries you set. I need more than words, Briana interrupted. It was an old, necessary reflex. Trust was not a gift. It was a ledger. You need to show me your channels. Who called you tonight? Who follows you home? Who answers when you don't pick up? I need names, and if you refuse, I will distance myself. For Leo. Valentina took a breath that trembled with a new humility. You will have them, she said. And something else. Her voice lowered. I don't want to be chased by my past anymore. If there is one thing I can offer, let me earn a place by being small in your life. Let me be accountable. The agreement was as domestic as anything. Names on a list, a promise to hand over numbers and to funnel work into legal public channels. But afterwards, alone in her bedroom, Briana found herself thinking of the way Valentina's hands had felt. Calloused, competent, careful. The touch left a memory on her skin like a faint print. Later that night, after Valentina had slept on the couch and Briana had checked the child's window twice to make sure it was latched, the household quieted into a soft domesticity. The rose at the kitchen table had dropped another petal. Briana placed the folded page from the envelope into her nightstand beside her phone. And then, as fatigue and a thinned courage would have it, she slid off her shoes and crossed the living room in bare feet. Valentina woke as Briana reached the couch. You can sleep, Briana whispered. Valentina did not answer immediately. Her voice when it came was small and steady. Tell me what would make you feel safer, she said. The vulnerability of the question landed with the force of a diagnostic, a request for a treatment protocol. Briana set the terms, precise and efficient. No unannounced visits, lists left on the table, immediate transparency about any outreach, regular check-ins, emergency contacts of lawyers and people Briana trusted. She would not relinquish the right to remove anyone from their lives who threatened Leo. Valentina accepted each stipulation with a gravity that suggested either sincere repentance or a carefully rehearsed performance. Briana could not tell which, and that uncertainty had become its own kind of pain. But at the edge of every doubt was evidence waiting to be earned. They slept in the same room that night as a strange kind of ceasefire. In the dim, their bodies were an arm's length apart. Valentina's breath came slow, and when it hit Briana's shoulder, it felt like an admission. Briana slept with one ear tuned to the small rhythms of the apartment and woke at dawn with the faint outline of two palms in her memory. It was small and human and utterly dangerous. A week later, after enough receipts had begun to stack in a drawer marked trust, and Valentina had shown up at the bake sale with an apron and a woman's humility, the city found a way to put its teeth into their lives. A reporter from a local paper called Amanda, and the story spread across the neighborhood with the cruel efficiency of rumor. Valentina's name, in large type, was paired with old scandals, insinuated debts, a photograph that made her look like something from a previous life. The headline was careful enough not to accuse, but it called up ghosts. Briana watched the article with the clinical detachment of someone reading a lab report, and then with the fierceness of a mother watching a winter storm approach. She went to the school the next morning and signed the attendance sheet with a hand that refused to shake. She could feel the eyes of other parents in the hall like small instruments of pressure. Leo, oblivious, recited a math problem to his teacher and then slackened into the playground like someone who could still be a child. Valentina, when she came to the house that evening, carried receipts and a volunteer roster folded into neat stacks. She had already printed the minutes of the last 3 meetings where she had appeared in person, and had copies of an invoice for the neighborhood cleanup she had legally donated to. She put them on the table with a small domestic flourish as if arranging a medicine tray. "It won't be enough," Briana said. Her voice had a nurse's flatness. "Proof is measured over time. One article doesn't erase a life, but it creates cracks, and those cracks matter." Valentina looked at her as if peeling herself open. "I know," she said. "I will keep producing receipts. I will let Isabella see the records. I will hand over contacts to Marco. I will make the public paperwork legible." Those words were not empty pronouncements. Valentina had, in the last weeks, made movements that looked like reparation. She had cut ties that had once been shorthand for favors and protection. She had stopped answering informal calls. She had given Briana lists of names, people she had mentored and people who still sought her to intervene. Briana had seen the discomfort when Valentina terminated a phone call mid-sentence, and then explained simply, "I will not be doing that anymore." The major breach came on a Tuesday that smelled of disinfectant and coffee. Briana found the notebook by accident. She was tidying Valentina's coat, which had been left over a chair, an act of habit allowed by a week of domesticity, and the pocket gave up a thin, battered notebook bound with a rubber band. It was Leonardo's handwriting across the cover. "Leo, if anyone ever needs me." Briana's hands went cold. She opened it and found pages of the kind of small private exhortations Leonardo had written when he was alive, half jokes about movies they would see, lists of things he wanted to do with his nephew, notes of small advice to Briana. How to shop for winter boots, the best place for flu shots, the address of a lawyer for emergencies. Mixed in, unexpectedly, and then unmistakably, were letters Leonardo had written to Valentina when he had been alive, the sort of practical, heartfelt notes a man might write when placing trust in another to look after a loved one. One was explicit. "Guards for you," the note read, but also, "Please, distance. Keep your name from our home, but watch the lights. Stay far enough that the world can breathe." Briana sat back as if the floor had been pulled away. The notebook was more than a relic. It was a will. Leonardo's handwriting had been careful and exact, the kind of practical tenderness he had always shown. The directive was uncanny in its intimacy. He had trusted Valentina to protect Briana, but he had also, in the same breath, warned her to stay away. An impossible combination of duty and caution. It was a paradox that made Briana's chest ache. When Briana confronted Valentina that night, the apartment was lit by a single lamp, and the rain chased the windows. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, holding the notebook like evidence. Valentina's face closed in lines that read as shame and fear. "I thought it would frighten you," she said at once. "I thought Leo was always the reason you kept people at a measured distance. I was worried that giving you the letters would make you retreat. I didn't want to be the cause of you taking steps away. I thought I was protecting you. Protecting me from the truth." Briana's voice had the calibrated cold of someone who had been betrayed by omission. "You hid his instructions that you watch over me but remain distant. You knew what he wanted. You decided for me." Valentina's hands trembled by her sides. "I was trying to do what he asked. I was trying to hold the line he wanted without making you lose someone who might be useful." She swallowed. "I miscalculated. I thought I could keep both promises." "You kept a secret that directly involved my son," Briana said. Her words were precise and small, and full of the kind of steel that only a mother could hinge on. "That is not protection. That is a decision you made for me. I needed to make that choice." For a long time they stood like that, one woman reciting lists of evidence, the other one trying to remember what humility felt like. Finally, Valentina did the thing that looked more like repair than words. She opened the notebook and read aloud from Leonardo's letters, not to perform, but to render visible the content she had withheld. The letters spoke in the voice of a brother who had been practical and worried and fiercely loving. They asked Valentina to look out for Briana's safety, and to keep a distance when necessary. The way the letters folded in on themselves, trust and distance, watch and do not intrude, made a kind of sorrowful sense. "You broke that trust in a different way," Briana said when Valentina finished. "Hiding them hurt more because it removed my agency. You decided the terms of my knowledge." "I know," Valentina said, and her words came like someone stripping away the last of her armor. "I thought I was sparing you fear. I see now that I was giving you less than the truth." The reparation they negotiated was immediate and surgical. Valentina would produce the letters in full, would hand the notebook to Briana, and would provide a list of all contacts who might have cause to come into their lives. Briana demanded public proof of change beyond the volunteer rosters. Bank transfers showing formal donations to community organizations instead of favors dispensed off the books. Signatures on legal documents transferring control of certain enterprises into Marco's hands with Isabella's oversight. A notarized statement relinquishing informal channels of influence. Valentina accepted each term without bluster. "If you need proof, ask me what you need," she said. "I will sign anything. I will hand things over. I will make the paperwork count for more than my word." But Isabella had to see it as well. Isabella, when she realized the depth of the demands, did not smile with immediate approval. She was a woman raised in the peculiar school of power, someone who understood legacies and the loss that renunciation could mean. The meeting with Isabella was not cinematic. It took place in a narrow office smelling of lemon oil and old leather, an arena of quiet negotiation rather than grand gestures. Valentina arrived with Marco, who had been briefed on the legal restructuring and who, unlike Isabella, was more comfortable with formalities than with the theatrics of honor. He sat with a pen like a tool and a ledger open. Isabella watched Valentina with an expression that catalogued the long arc of someone who had been kept in accounts. "You ask me to remove you from a portion of the book," Isabella said, her voice measured. "Why should I believe this is not an attempt to regain control later?" Valentina placed a single folder on the desk and then another. She had brought receipts, contracts, letters of resignation and transfer, and a plan for redirecting funds to legitimate charities. She had Marco's signature on a transfer agreement and a notarized letter promising oversight. The move felt like the slow, bureaucratic equivalent of making a will. "I will not be the person who uses debt to buy people's silence," Valentina said. "I will move my influence into structures that have transparency. I will accept audits. I will be answerable." Isabella's eyes narrowed but did not harden entirely. "You understand this will cost you more than money," she said. "You will be visible in all the places you would rather not be visible. You will lose the agility that comes from operating in the shadows." "I want to be ordinary," Valentina answered. The declaration was both brave and naive. "I want meals I don't have to justify. I want to be someone who can go to a PTA meeting and not have to explain why I once did things differently." Isabella considered that and finally nodded. "Then prove it in public, for as long as it takes to convince me." That was the condition that changed everything. Not a grand confession or a single legal document, but sustained labor in the light. Valentina accepted. She handed the papers to Marco to process, and then returned, after a week, to Briana with a new stack of evidence. Transfers, volunteer logs, formal letters of withdrawal from directorships. She had signed over a portion of her discretionary accounts to a newly formed nonprofit with 3 external board members, one of which was an audited accountant Briana did not know and trusted precisely because Briana did not. The months that followed were deliberate and slow. They were not cinematic reforms so much as the banal, steady accrual of accountability. Valentina attended PTA in person and raised her hand at a meeting to support a fundraiser, her voice steady and unbothered. She volunteered at the community shelter every Wednesday night, serving meals under a name tag that read, Valentina M. Her name began to exist in receipt books and on letterheads, instead of being a whispered promise. Briana watched the evidence pile up in a folder, receipts, volunteer logs, signed contracts. Each item was small and precise, and taken together, they became an archive of transformation. She had been explicit that a wedding or any public claim of intimacy would require not only proof, but duration. Months of consistent behavior that proved not to be performance. Valentina accepted the timeline and the slow burn of it. There were difficulties. Old associates called and asked for favors. Some were blunt and insolent. Valentina said no to a man one afternoon when he asked for money in exchange for a quiet promise. He threatened, softly, with the kind of menace that is practiced among people whose anger is a currency. Valentina told him she would not be participating in that economy anymore. She took the call in front of Briana and then turned the phone over to Marco so there would be a record. A transcript of refusal. That act, public, administrative, and unglamorous, meant more to Briana than many promises. At the hospital, Briana continued to live the life she understood best. To care. She would come home and find a volunteer vest folded on the chair, a sandwich left on her counter, receipts neatly taped into a cardboard folder labeled proof. These small domestic acts became the mechanism by which trust was rebuilt. Valentina did not stop surprising her by doing the ordinary things with absolute care, showing up at a parent-teacher conference and laughing in the right places, fixing a leak in the building through an official contractor, and paying the bill into the building association's account, rather than sorting it out through friends. Then the journalist came again, this time with the intent to test. A follow-up piece ran that chronicled Valentina's official philanthropic work and quoted the people she had helped. It was neither a cleansing nor a coronation. It simply recorded a set of facts. Some neighbors shrugged, others remained skeptical. But the newspapers that had once used her name like a weapon now printed invoices and proof as part of the narrative. Where gossip had once been a blade, evidence turned the gossip into something measurable. When Briana finally allowed herself to consider the idea of the wedding, an act she had earlier considered impossible without a long ledger of proof, she did so with the careful eyes of someone examining a pathology report. It would not be a spectacle. It would be a ritual of accountability. It would have witnesses who mattered. Amanda and a few colleagues from the hospital, Marco and Isabella with their guarded blessing, a neighbor or two who had watched the small changes. Valentina proposed a ceremony small enough to avoid the cameras, but intended to be public enough to be recorded. She wanted it to be the kind of day where receipts and continuity mattered less than promises to live under certain terms. Briana's sense of the sacrament of motherhood meant she would involve Leo in ways that preserved his innocence. He would hand them the rings, simple bands they had chosen together at a community jeweler, and say a few lines if he wanted. He did, shy and solemn, and said something childish and deep about ants and rain that made everyone laugh. They wrote vows that were not theatrical. Valentina's vow was short and precise. She promised to translate her influence into service, to be answerable to audit and oversight, to choose transparency over expedience. She promised to put Leo's safety above her own desires, to hand over the channels that once meant she could make things happen with a phone call. Briana's vow was less formal, but no less grave. She promised to grant permission and to ask for evidence when she needed it, to allow someone in without ceding her right to protect her son, to keep insisting on receipts and logs and continued accountability. There was a moment during the vow when Briana looked at Valentina and saw not the woman whose name once carried the turn of dangerous rooms, but a person who had learned how to do the small work of tending. Valentina's hands were not polished instruments of command anymore. They were hands calloused from volunteer shifts and from carrying groceries for neighbors. When Briana took Valentina's hands in hers, it was as if she was reading an X-ray and seeing healed bone. They did not promise to erase the past. They promised to live beside it and not be owned by it. The crowd at the modest ceremony, people who had been skeptical and people who had been quietly rooting for them both, applauded with that curious mixture of reserve and warmth reserved for neighbors who had fought a long winter together. After the ceremony, they ate pizza in the church basement and laughed at the way Leo tried to toss an extra slice under the table like a small revolutionary. Isabella sat at the end of a long folding table, and, for once, was not a figure of cold calculation, but of something like cautious approval. Marco talked with Amanda about municipal finance, and somehow the conversation felt less like territory, and more like the noticing of how lives change. The weeks that followed were not an exit from struggle, but a continuation of the ledger. Valentina continued to report to Marco. The nonprofit published quarterly statements. There were audits. There were evenings when a threatening voicemail arrived, and Valentina would take it and file it like an administrative error, calling the police and forwarding the document to a lawyer, rather than answering with the old instinct to settle matters informally. Briana watched this with the quiet pride of someone learning to trust evidence again. At home, the domestic life they built felt like a project that required daily maintenance. They painted Leo's bedroom together on a Saturday, arguing gently about the shade of blue, while the radio played an old lullaby that Leonardo used to whistle. Valentina, who had once made decisions for rooms with sweeping gestures, sat on the floor with a paintbrush and a small pot of primer, learning to work within tape lines. She hummed the lullaby under her breath at odd moments, an almost private exorcism turned habit. One spring morning, they planted tomatoes in a small patch behind the stoop, and Valentina learned something about patience. It was a practical lesson in tending. If you cut a vine too aggressively, you lose fruit. If you prune methodically, the plant strengthens. The metaphor was not new, but in their hands it felt like a daily ethic. Valentina's hands, once used to issuing commands, learned the small economy of pruning. She trimmed branches and tied support stakes, watched seedlings with the kind of attention that once had been reserved for plans and ledgers. On a day when the sun was thin and the city smelled faintly of baked bread, Briana watched Valentina kneel in the dirt, sleeves pushed up, soil under her nails. She was not making a spectacle of redemption. She was doing the boring labor of a citizen. "You look ridiculous," Briana said, and then added softer. "In a good way." Valentina wiped her hands on her jeans and looked up. There was a small smile on her face, not an apology this time, but a contentment that came from the match of work and meaning. "It suits me," she said, "to be quiet like this." There were, inevitably, moments when the old shadows of reputation crept back in. An old associate tried to use a past link to solicit a favor for a friend. A minor scandal threatened a board member of the nonprofit. A call at 2 a.m. from a number that could not be traced. The difference was the currency by which Valentina responded now. Legal channels, documentation, public transparency. She handed the files to Marco, or filed them with the police, or simply refused and left a record. The risks remained, but the ways they were handled had changed. Sometimes, in the quiet after Leo had gone to bed and the apartment smelled of lemon oil and tomato sauce, they would sit at the kitchen table and say the phrase that had begun it all as if testing its edges. "She loved me in every life," Valentina would sometimes say, the cadences of the sentence softer now. "Except this one." Briana had been repeating the line to herself for months. Now she met it not with despair, but with a kind of astonishment. "Not accepted anymore," she corrected once, and Valentina's mouth turned. There was no miraculous erasure of past deeds. There was no sweeping cult of personality rehabilitation. Instead, there were receipts, signatures, volunteer hours logged, petty arguments about chores, nights when Leo had nightmares, and Valentina's voice, calm and steady, would seat the child back into sleep with stories she had learned to tell. Sometimes Valentina would tell him a parable of past lives as a bedtime story. An old grandmother had told her that people found each other in different shapes across time, and that sometimes you got it right, and sometimes you didn't. She told the story like a fable, careful to leave metaphysical claims out of it, making it a comfort rather than a doctrine. They endured distance from some neighbors who could not reconcile the past and refused to accept the present. They lost a few relationships that had demanded a yield Valentina would not grant. But in the household, the small rituals of permission and proof had become the law by which they lived. Leo learned to trust a new kind of normal, that grown-ups could argue, file receipts, and then sit down and play a board game with him. He learned that safety could be both bureaucratic and tender. Years later, in the soft dim of a living room where the children's toys were less numerous, and the garden had a trellis that held a climbing rose, a nod to the one that had been placed on the ER counter the night they met, Valentina and Briana stood side by side trimming a vine. The act had become a ritual. Find the dead wood, cut it away, tie the new growth to support. It was a quiet geometry of care. Leo, taller now, with a voice like an adolescent and a smirk he used on purpose, handed them a pair of pruning shears with the sense of someone who had watched the rules be enacted for years. "You always cut too much," Briana told Valentina, not unkindly. She remembered the early days of their courtship, the way she had observed a woman who had once wrenched the world into shape with a glance. Now, she watched the same hands hesitate over a stem and choose restraint over conquest. Valentina's fingers lingered on the vine. "I am still learning," she said. Her voice carried the residue of years of small labor. She had the look of someone who had been given a second profession. Tending. Her hands bore the calluses of volunteer work and the faint yellow stain of tea and paint and soil. They were imperfect and honest. They had reached a place that felt like a settlement between history and present. They had not erased damage. They had incurred new marks, court filings, acrimonious phone calls, nights spent waiting for lawyers' emails. But they had built a daily ledger that measured care by facts, and not by promises alone. They had, in the language Briana used 1,000 times in the sterile light of the ER, made a successful conversion, influence transmuted into service. One evening, as the sun slid behind the row of brick buildings and the air cooled, Valentina sat on the stoop with Leo and Briana beside her. He was older and quieter, but still a child in the ways that mattered. He still picked up odd stones and painted them, and once in a while he left a painted rock at their doorstep, as if testing fate. That night, he had a small, smooth stone painted like a dinosaur, and a question about college that made Valentina laugh in an absent, affectionate way. Valentina reached into her pocket and took out a small square of paper. She handed it to Briana, whose fingers brushed the letter V on the corner. "I keep things," Valentina said softly. "Sometimes I keep things to remember, but I also keep things to remind me of promises." Briana looked at the paper and unfolded it. It was Leonardo's handwriting, the same loops she had once found in the notebook. There was a single line, something that had been written years ago, perhaps as a joke or a prophecy, and which now read with a new tenderness. "We have loved before. Make this life count." Briana folded the paper and put it in her pocket, close to the cards and to her phone, and to the small domestic talismans that kept their life together. She looked at Valentina and saw something she had not been able to name in the earliest nights. A woman who had been taught to command and had learned, with effort and record-keeping and sometimes reluctant grace, to yield to the small work of tending. "Do you still say it?" Valentina asked suddenly, and the question thinly veiled in exposure. "Sometimes," Briana admitted. She remembered early nights in the ER when the phrase had lodged under a machine's beep like an allergy. Not like an accusation anymore. More like a fact I have to check. It helps me not forget the ledger. Valentina smiled, and the smile had a softness that seemed almost miraculous. No, not miraculous. Earned, bureaucratically and tenderly. "She loved me in every life," Valentina said, the words tasting like an offered reconciliation. "Except this one." Briana turned the phrase over, the way a surgeon turns a patient's chart to see the whole view. "Now," she said, "it's not accepted." The finality of the sentence was neither complete nor triumphant. It was instead a careful truth, the kind that grows out of months and years of mundane proof. They had loved in other shapes perhaps, in whispers and in passing that none of them could verify. In this life, however, they had to keep score in ink and with receipts and with the small axe that signaled a habit of care. Leo pushed his chair back and stood between them, taller and more solemn than his age entitled him to be. "Promise me something," he said with the bluntness of a child who understood what trust looked like. "Promise you'll always tell the truth about the bad things." Valentina's reply was immediate. "I promise to tell the truth," she said. She spoke with the sort of clarity that comes from having learned consequence. She looked at Briana and added, "And I will keep the receipts." Briana reached out and squeezed Valentina's hand. It was the smallest possible ceremony, a handshake of people who did not yet trust entirely, but were willing to continue the ledger. The garden around them held the soft noise of crickets, and the faint smell of soil turned warm by the last rays of sun. A while later, when the street had emptied and the town's lamps hummed, Briana lay awake and reflected on the arc of their life. The rose with the black ribbon, once a symbol of an intrusion, now sat in her memory like a strange beginning relic. The letters, the receipts, the volunteer logs, the notarized signatures, all these small evidentiary things had become the scaffolding by which a dangerous past was not erased, but contained and rerouted into social good. They had, in the process, redefined what it meant to love across lives. Not as a metaphysical claim, but as an insistence on accountability. The phrase she had whispered into coffee on long nights began to feel like an answer rather than a complaint. She had once thought the world would keep her out of a love that had loved her in other shapes. Now, she had learned that some lives loved in every life, including a life that required receipts and boundaries, and a willingness to be accountable. She loved me in every life, this one included. At dawn, they would wake, and the living would continue. School drop-offs and hospital shifts, and the small bureaucracy of day-to-day life. There would still be threats from old people who wanted favors, and nights when Valentina would have to face someone who resented her withdrawal. There would still be press inquiries, and the occasional neighbor who refused to believe in change. But the life they had assembled, measured in votes at PTA meetings, in volunteer rosters, in the slow accumulation of proof, was theirs. It was not perfect. It was not safe from the world. But it housed a son, a woman who had learned to be gentle instead of commanding, and another who guarded that gentleness with a ledger and with love. Outside, a new rosebush had been planted by the stoop. Purchased at a community fundraiser, its donation logged in an invoice sealed in a folder. Valentina knelt to the soil that morning and carefully pressed the roots into place. She tied a small black ribbon, this time not a symbol of threat but a reminder, around a slender branch where it would be seen only if someone truly looked. When Leo saw the ribbon, he nodded with the kind of solemnity children reserve for religious observances, and then handed them both a painted rock he had kept for months. Briana took it with the sort of gratitude that feels like a vow, to cherish the small things they had pledged never to let become currency again. They stood then on the stoop, hands dirty from soil and life, and Briana, without theatrics, whispered the phrase they had used like a test and turned it into an affirmation. "We loved before," she said, looking at Valentina. "And we love now." Valentina responded with the quiet she had learned to keep. "This life," she said, and the words were like pruning shears, precise, careful. "This one counts." The city carried on with its indifferent hum, bus engines and bakery ovens and the distant metallic clatter of a late-night delivery. But inside that small household the work continued, receipts filed, volunteer shifts logged, a child's laughter shared across a kitchen table. They had moved the weight of power into the small labor of tending, and in that domestic economy they had found a way to make a love, once dangerous and mysterious, into something that could be built day by day. She had loved me in every life, except this one, not anymore. This life, finally, included them both. If love was tested by the small daily ledger of actions and proof, then perhaps it was not a miracle at all, but a long, slow, and purposeful evolution. One that in the end, answered the old whisper with the steady proof of hands in the dirt, of receipts in the drawer, and of a child sleeping deeply because the grown people in his life had learned how to keep him safe.